Hi, thanks very much for coming. So I'm from, as you heard, from an English department, and I'm going to tell you about the Industrial Revolution. Part of the reason is because I was trained as a romanticist a long time ago, and if you're a romanticist, you're told that, you know, dark satanic mills, terrible things, and Wordsworth's going to show you what life really is. And because I think the best research should be led by curiosity, I've spent the last 15 years looking what people write and did in the area most associated with the Industrial Revolution. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not going to claim that poetry caused the Industrial Revolution. But I am going to talk about what I call the Trans Pennine Enlightenment, which is another way of looking at the Industrial Revolution. Now, the idea of the Industrial Revolution has been through a sustained period of revisionist scholarship by economic historians. And my colleagues in this department look at it very strangely when I tell them I've been mainly reading economic history for the last 10 years, but that's part of what I have been doing. And that revisionism, though, has been around the idea of whether what happened warrants the term revolution, whether there was any sort of big bang. A consensus has formed around the idea that there was sort of longer-term and unevenly distributed change. But where there was transformational change, a period of takeoff, as it used to be called, a takeoff to growth, in the period between 1770 and 1840, was in particular places and in particular industries, especially the coming of the factory and then the steam factory system, which were two very distinct events, I think, into the cotton industry in the area around Manchester. These changes were widely recognized by contemporaries such as John Aitken Jr. in his description of the country around Manchester, 1795. John Aitken was a physician and a poet who was educated at the Warrington Academy for Protestant dissenters. It was really the only higher education institution for the late 18th century for non-Anglicans, but was also a centre of progressive ideas. It taught business studies, medicine, as well as rhetoric and belles lettres, very much more advanced and modern than Oxford and Cambridge were at the time. He then went on from Warrington to be educated at the foremost European medical training you could get at the time, which was Edinburgh. Aitken's vision of Manchester was of a networked hub. These are details from the map that appear with his book. And I think through the maps you start to see the importance to Aitken of the transport revolution, as it used to be called, the building of roads and canals and connecting up a new kind of body politic. Indeed, if you squint at those maps, you can start to see why they might be in a book written by a doctor, because it starts to look like a cardiovascular system arranged around, or indeed a neural network, and you'll see why I use that metaphor later. And Aitken himself says that Manchester, as it were, was the heart of this vast system, the circulating branches of which spread all around it. Aitken, if you like, was thinking of a new kind of body politic, a body politic that was based on useful knowledge, innovation, a body politic whose heart was Manchester and not what we now call the golden triangle of old knowledge centred in Oxford, Cambridge, and London, as I believe it's called. Now, poet and physician, but Aitken also loved engineering. If the book has a hero, it's the canal builder James Brindley, and he thought that Brindley had brought about completely unique changes in the connectivity of the country. And the title page of Aitken's books shows us a sort of futuristic vision, not of inland navigation, but of canals and aqueducts built over estuaries. And he described his title pages giving a kind of visionary anticipation of the future wonders of canal navigation. So his book has an idea of potentially limitless growth, although I'm going to talk about the way that Aitken imagined some limits to that. Now, I started by talking about some of the revisionism of economic historians about the origins of the Industrial Revolution. And one way that question has been phrased is about what's called the Great Divergence. And the simple version of that question is, China was one of the richest nations on earth in the 18th century, famous for inventions, gunpowder, printing, etc. Britain was a pretty 50% European little country, or had been until the previous 150 years. Why is it that in Britain there was a takeoff into industrial society, a transformation in the nature of society, which in a way we're still living through, or if you like, we're coming to the end of. And one set of answers to this were provided by the economic historians Jon Mee and Margaret Jacob. And they suggested that it wasn't the inventions that mattered. China had those. It was that Britain was a society, a relatively open society, a relatively meritocratic society that had a huge investment in the circulation of ideas. So if somebody invented something, news spread very quickly, and people very quickly got interested in the ramifications of that invention, in application, and in further development of it. And Margaret Jacob has claimed the Industrial Revolution ought to be understood as the first knowledge economy, very much a buzz phrase now, of course. And Mockier's work has stressed that macro inventions are important, what he calls macro inventions, the big inventions, are important because they always triggered a continuous flow of secondary and incremental inventions and improvements. And it's that sort of change that leads to the industrial takeoff. And he also stresses that it was a provincial experience. Mokier says, despite the huge size of London, the Industrial Enlightenment and the intellectual activities it spawned were distinctly provincial events, located in institutions such as the scientific societies in smaller English towns or the Scottish universities of Glasgow and Edinburgh. These institutions were often located near centres of industries and often served as clearinghouses for useful knowledge between natural philosophers, engineers, and entrepreneurs. Now, chief among the societies doing this kind of work that Mokier and others have discussed were the literary and philosophical societies, and it's on those that my research has centred for the last 10 years. Many of them still exist. The first important one was Manchester, which still exists, but its original 18th century building was destroyed in the Second World War. But Manchester in 1781 was followed in 1793 by Newcastle, and the Newcastle Lit Phil just exists, still exists, sorry. If you arrive by train in Newcastle at Central Station, turn right and right again, you'll come to this building built in 1823, 30 years after the foundation of the society. It's kind of interesting that it was built 30 years later because a building both houses things but also has a slightly exclusive role again, which is part of the story I won't have much time to go into today apart from the end. Now, probably the star turn at the Lit Phils, the most famous person associated with Lit Phils in this period was John Dalton, who gave a series of lectures on his atomic theory in the late 1790s and early 1800s. But when I started to look at the things published by the Lit Phils and in their archives and minutes, many of which still exist, including the ones at the Newcastle, the Manchester ones were destroyed, I found that actually the topics discussed there were rather more diverse than Mokier's sense of the circulation of technical knowledge suggests. Many of the papers were published in the ones at Manchester were published in Memoirs of the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society, which was translated and widely circulated. Papers given at Newcastle were also published, but they tended to be sent to periodical publications like the Monthly Magazine. But a lot of the stuff gets out and gets into public circulation. Reading these published papers and reading in the minutes, three important themes emerge for me. First of all, the idea of knowledge as a network phenomena. We only ever really know things if it's shared with other people, and we only really progress if you get the spark of ideas, one person's ideas being introduced to another idea, and the metaphor that recurs in a lot of their papers, knowledge is a kind of flint that comes from a spark that comes from two opposite ideas being rubbed against each other. I also saw, though, and this is where my literary interests come in, that taste, the idea of taste, is again and again occurs as a topic in the papers in this period, as something that creates a moral sense beyond getting and spending in new commercial towns. There's an emphasis that young men, and it is men especially, there's an issue about women in these networks, which I'm happy to talk about in questions, but the young men should be reading the literature, including, it's emphasized, literature written by women, in order to get a moral sense that will give some sort of end game, some sort of objective, some sort of limit, moral limit or moral horizon to these innovations. An interesting part of this was that taste is understood as an embodied experience, part of a general sense of the entanglement of the mind in the body. So the way you react to things, your sense of taste, isn't an abstract idea of aesthetics. It's an idea of aesthetics grounded on looking at sensations in the body and the way they react to things. Now, very influential on these developments were a phalanx of Edinburgh-trained medical men who included John Aitken himself, the Manchester Society's founder Thomas Percival, and a man called John Ferrier, who with Percival founded the country's first Board of Health in 1796, arguably the first instance of public medicine in this country, the Board of Health in Manchester. But Ferrier also gave papers at the Litfield on Lawrence Sterne, and later became the author of a book called Illustrations of Sterne. Now, the teacher of these three men in Edinburgh was William Cullen, who gave all his students, who included Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, gave his students a sense of the vitality of the body's nervous system and the complexity of its responsiveness to circumstances beyond immediate stimuli. Roughly speaking, or as I like to say, roughly speaking, he has a sense of disease as being produced not by things in the body, but by a wider set of contexts, which he called remote and proximate causes. So disease is a product of remote and proximate causes. This is the beginning of environmental medicine, if you like, but it also starts thinking disease is potentially to do with culture, the kind of society you live in. And for instance, Thomas Percival, his student who I said founded the Manchester Litfield, said that as relations, employments, offices and ranks are multiplied, the connections or collisions of duty and interest are also multiplied, and combinations of principles of action are formed or known in the primeval state of man. Society, as it industrializes, is becoming increasingly complex, and the question of causation is increasingly a product of the relationship between remote and proximate causes. You can see these influences, I think, in Aitken's research on the Industrial Revolution, because Aitken always stresses the idea that the great discoveries are the product of what he calls gradual advances given to them by successive improvers. There's a culture of innovation, and you can see the overlap there with Mocquier's ideas, although strangely Mocquier's research never mentions John Aitken. You can also, I think, see why infrastructural connectivity is very important to Aitken. The health of the body politic will depend on its complex connections. And because of this as well, Aitken's description of Manchester isn't just celebratory, it also has a lot on the influence of remote and proximate causes of what we might call the pathology of industrial development. And the book uses research done by Ferrier and Percival on the emergence of new diseases produced, they claim, by the working and living conditions brought by the new factory arrangements and the influx of new diseases. But they're also interested in the question of the fate of nature in the face of Brindley's canal building project. Brindley was very famously asked by the parliamentary committee what he thought of rivers, and he's meant to have asked, they're very good for building bridges over. Okay, which Aitken report, even though he heroicized Brindley, he reported that negative. And he was also interested and concerned about the role of capital generated by the slave trade in the industrial development of the Northwest. Now, this sense of a nuanced response to industrial development, not simply its rejection, but worried about its limits and form, I think it was even obvious to Marx when he read Aitken's book, because Das Kapital, which everybody thinks was written in the British Museum, was partly written in Manchester in Chetham's library. And Marx makes a lot of use of Aitken's book. And indeed, the fat book in the middle there is Aitken's description of Manchester. And that desk, so I'm starting to look worriedly at the person holding you haven't held a number up yet, but I'm aware of the movement in the front row. That book in the middle there of the desk, the fat book, is John Aitken's description of Manchester, and that is the desk at which Marx wrote Capital. And Marx actually said in Capital, what would the good Dr. Aitken say if he could rise from his grave and see the Manchester of today? I think that shows that Marx was aware of the question of limits. And I'd suggest, indeed, that there's a kind of dialectics of enlightenment going on across this period. After the Napoleonic War, there was a revival of Litfields. Liverpool in 1812, Leeds in 1819, where it's called the Philosophical and Literary Society, not the other way around. and Sheffield. And in certain regards, what we see is a narrowing of the earlier strains I've talked about, especially those open ideas of connectivity shared by those literary physicians. And I think the best example of that is James Phillips Kay's very famous book, The Moral and Physical Condition of the Working Classes. Kay's book was given as a paper at the Lit Phil. He's a Manchester doctor. He's interested in the way disease is caused by the moral formation of society. But where Ferrier, Percival, and Aitken have a sense of the complex cause in that, Kay has a much narrower view on that if you like, blamed the victims. He saw cholera as a product of the moral failings of the working class and thought actually that those kind of middle-class people who are in the Lit Phil should intervene in that culture to improve the working classes, to make them into better people. But there's a lot more, I think, to say about that, but as Hammy the hamster used to say at Tales from the Riverside, that's a different story for another day. Thank you very much. Okay.